"She can't even read the menu," the man said, loud enough for the entire table to hear, as if the words themselves were part of the evening's entertainment rather than an insult, and the laughter that followed was soft but sharp, like glass lightly tapped with a silver spoon. The restaurant carried that kind of sound well. It was designed to. Low amber lighting settled over polished wood and white linen, catching the edges of crystal glasses and the slow swirl of a $2,000 Bordeaux, while conversations drifted just beneath a hush that wasn't silence, but something curated, controlled, expensive. Clara Whitmore moved through it all like she belonged to the rhythm, but not the room, her steps measured, her posture straight, her expression composed in that quiet way that made people forget to look twice. Table 12 had been marked before the shift even started, a small note beside the reservation. Langston, Edward particular. It was the kind of word that didn't describe a preference, but a pattern. Clara had seen it before. Men who treated precision like power. Men who believed the world adjusted itself to their expectations. She approached the table with the same steady grace she used for every guest, placing the leather-bound menus gently on the linen, aligning them without thinking, her fingers brushing the edge of one just long enough to feel the faint embossing of gold letters pressed into its surface. French. Of course it was. "Good evening, Mr. Langston," she said, her voice calm, even professional, the kind that didn't rise or fall for approval. He didn't look at her right away. That, too, was deliberate. When he finally did, it was brief, dismissive, like checking the time. "We'll need a moment," he said, though he had already opened the menu, his eyes scanning it with the confidence of someone who believed understanding was automatic. Across from him, his guest leaned back slightly, watching, a man with the relaxed posture of someone accustomed to observing rather than performing. The conversation resumed in French, smooth and fluid, or at least intended to be. Clara didn't react. She stepped back half a pace, just enough to give space, not enough to disappear. It was a practice distance. Invisible but present. The man continued, his tone shifting subtly, not louder, but sharper, as if the language itself gave him permission to say more than he otherwise would. A comment about the menu, about the complexity, about how not everyone was equipped to navigate it. The guest responded with a small nod, his expression unreadable, his eyes flicking briefly, just briefly, toward Clara before returning to Edward. Clara's hands remained still at her sides, her breathing steady, her gaze neutral, fixed somewhere just past the edge of the table. She had learned that stillness wasn't submission. It was control. Edward tapped the menu lightly with one finger, then looked up again, this time with a faint smile that didn't reach his eyes. "You can take it," he said, sliding the menu slightly toward her, though the gesture carried more implication than instruction. "Unless," he added, almost casually, "you need help understanding it." The words landed gently, but the intention didn't. For a moment, nothing changed. Not the light, not the sound, not the quiet rhythm of the room continuing around them. Clara reached forward, her fingers closing around the menu with the same precise motion she had used all evening, her eyes lowering just enough to acknowledge the object without acknowledging the comment. And for the briefest fraction of a second, her gaze paused, not confused, not uncertain, but familiar, as if she weren't reading it for the first time, as if she never had to. Clara turned slightly, placing the menu back onto the table with a quiet precision that matched the room, her fingers releasing it without hesitation, without the slightest indication of uncertainty. And when she spoke, her voice carried the same calm tone as before, untouched by the undercurrent beneath the exchange. "Of course, sir. May I recommend the duck à l'orange this evening, or perhaps the bouillabaisse? The chef prepared it with saffron imported this week, and it is particularly balanced tonight." The words settled into the air differently, not louder, not sharper, but unmistakably exact, the pronunciation clean, the cadence natural, each syllable placed with the ease of someone who did not translate, but simply knew. And for the first time, Edward Langston paused, not visibly at first, just a fraction of a second too long before responding, his fingers still resting on the edge of his glass. His gaze lifting toward her again, this time not dismissive, but searching for something he had not expected to find. His guest noticed it before he did. The man leaned forward slightly, his expression shifting with quiet interest, and when he spoke, it was in French, but slower now, more deliberate, as if testing the space between them, as if placing a question not just in language, but in intent. Clara did not hesitate. She answered immediately, her tone unchanged, her posture still composed, her eyes steady but respectful, and the conversation moved, not back to Edward, but forward, toward her, the flow of words redirecting itself in a way that was almost imperceptible, except for the fact that Edward was no longer at the center of it. He cleared his throat softly, a sound that might have gone unnoticed anywhere else. But here, in this carefully controlled quiet, it carried weight, and he spoke again in French, faster this time, sharper, as if reclaiming ground. But there was a slight misstep, a subtle shift in pronunciation, something small enough that most would not have heard it, something that would have passed in any ordinary setting, but not here, not now, not after what had already been revealed. Clara did not interrupt. She waited, just long enough. Then, with a softness that felt almost like courtesy, she corrected a single word, her voice gentle, precise, the accent unmistakably Parisian, not exaggerated, not performed, just right, and the correction did not challenge him. It did not expose him, but it lingered in the space between them, undeniable, and the guest's eyes moved from Edward to Clara again, this time with something closer to recognition. The balance shifted, not dramatically, not loudly, but completely. The guest continued, now directing his words toward Clara, asking about the preparation, the sourcing, the intention behind the menu, and she responded with clarity, with detail, with an understanding that extended beyond memorization into familiarity, describing textures, origins, and subtle variations as if she had lived within them. And Edward sat back slightly, his hand tightening just enough around his glass to suggest awareness, his expression controlled, but no longer certain. Around them, the restaurant remained unchanged, the low light, the quiet conversations, the soft clink of silverware continuing as if nothing had happened. And yet at table 12, something had shifted in a way that could not be reversed, not because of what was said, but because of who was now being listened to. And Clara, standing exactly where she had been moments before, had not raised her voice, had not changed her posture, had not demanded attention, but she had taken it completely and without asking. The air at table 12 no longer belonged to Edward Langston, and he felt it before he could name it, in the way the conversation moved without waiting for him, in the way his guest leaned slightly toward Clara instead of across the table, in the way silence began to gather around his words while hers carried forward with quiet certainty, and he adjusted his posture, subtle but deliberate, setting his glass down with a controlled motion as if reclaiming the space required only a shift in presence. "That will be all for now," he said, returning to English, his tone measured, but there was an edge beneath it, something restrained, something recalibrating. Clara inclined her head just slightly, acknowledging the statement without stepping back from the moment that had already unfolded, and she reached for the wine bottle, her movements unhurried, precise, as she poured with a steady hand, the deep red liquid catching the light before settling into the glass. The guest watched her, not openly, but with that same quiet attention, the kind reserved for details that mattered more than they appeared to. And when Clara stepped back, he spoke again, this time switching between English and French without announcement, testing not her comprehension, but her consistency. She followed effortlessly, her responses fluid, her transitions seamless, never correcting, never asserting, simply matching the rhythm as if it had always been shared. Edward picked up his glass, but did not drink. His gaze shifted between them, calculating, measuring, searching for the boundary he had missed, and finding none. "Where did you learn that?" he asked suddenly, his voice directed at Clara. The question simple, but the intention sharper, as if the answer might restore something he had lost in the exchange. Clara met his gaze briefly, just enough to acknowledge the question, but not enough to challenge it. "I've been around it for some time, sir," she said, her tone unchanged, offering nothing more. nothing less, and the answer settled in a way that closed the door without appearing to. The guest smiled faintly, recognizing the restraint, recognizing the precision, and he leaned back slightly, folding his hands as he looked at Edward, then back at Clara. "It is rare," he said, his accent softer now, less formal, more personal, to hear it spoken without effort. Clara did not respond immediately. She allowed the compliment to pass through the air without catching it, without holding onto it, and instead she reached for the edge of the table, adjusting a fork that had shifted a fraction of an inch out of alignment, the movement small, almost invisible, but exact. Edward noticed that. He noticed everything now, the way she did not react to praise, the way she did not fill silence, the way she did not seek approval. It was unfamiliar, it was unsettling, and it was undeniable. He set his glass down again, this time with more care, his fingers lingering just a moment longer than necessary before releasing it. And when he spoke, it was slower, more deliberate, as if each word had to pass through a filter that had not existed before. "Bring us the duck," he said, his eyes still on her, "and the bouillabaisse." Clara nodded once, a small, contained motion, and as she turned, her gaze passed over the table one last time, not lingering on either man, not marking the shift that had taken place, not acknowledging the silence that followed her departure. And as she moved back into the rhythm of the room, blending again into the quiet flow of service, Edward Langston remained where he was, seated in a space that looked exactly the same as it had minutes before, yet felt entirely different because for the first time that evening, he was no longer the one being listened to. The kitchen doors swung open and closed in a steady rhythm, releasing brief waves of heat, butter, and simmering stock into the cooler, curated calm of the dining room, and Clara moved through it without breaking stride, her hand steady as she carried the tray, the porcelain plates balanced with a precision that did not come from practice alone, but from something deeper, something that understood timing the way a musician understands silence. And when she returned to table 12, the conversation had quieted, not ended, but softened, as if both men were now aware of something unspoken sitting between them. She approached from the left, placing the bouillabaisse first, the aroma rising gently, saffron and sea, layered and deliberate. Then the duck, its glaze catching the light in a way that made it look almost still, as if it had been composed rather than cooked, and she set each dish down with exact alignment, not a fraction of an inch out of place, her movements neither rushed nor slow, simply correct. "Your bouillabaisse, sir," she said, her tone even, and the duck à l'orange, the French words slipping into the sentence without emphasis, without performance, as if they belonged there, as if they always had. Edward watched her hands, not her face, noticing the control, the lack of hesitation, the absence of any need to prove what had already been shown, and for a moment he said nothing. His guest, however, leaned in slightly, inhaling the dish before him, his expression shifting with quiet approval, and he spoke again in French, asking a question about the broth, about the balance, about whether the fennel had been adjusted for the season. Clara answered without pause, her explanation precise but restrained, describing the variation in the stock, the subtle change in the acidity, the way the kitchen compensated for the difference in the shellfish available this week, and she did not elaborate beyond what was necessary, did not decorate the answer, did not claim credit for knowledge, she simply carried. Edward picked up his fork, cutting into the duck with a measured motion, the knife gliding cleanly, and he took a bite, chewing slowly, his expression unchanged, but his attention divided now between the plate and the presence standing beside it. "It is acceptable," he said, the same word he had used countless times before, but it did not land the same way, not here, not now, and even he seemed to recognize that, because the word lingered without authority. Clara inclined her head once, acknowledging the statement as she would any other, and stepped back half a pace, giving space, not retreating, not withdrawing, simply allowing the table to exist without her, while remaining entirely aware of it. The guest smiled faintly, tasting the broth, then glancing up at her again, and there was something like curiosity in his expression now, not about the food, but about her, about the quiet consistency that had not shifted since the first moment she approached the table. Edward set his fork down, his fingers resting lightly against the handle, and for the first time that evening, he did not immediately speak, did not fill the silence, did not assert control over the space that had always responded to him before, and instead, he looked at Clara, directly this time, his gaze steady, searching, as if trying to reconcile the version of her he had assumed with the one standing in front of him now. "You have been here long?" he asked, the question simple, but stripped of the earlier condescension, replaced by something quieter, something closer to uncertainty. Clara met his gaze for a brief moment, her expression unchanged, her posture still composed, and she answered with the same measured calm. "Long enough to learn, sir." The response did not explain anything. It did not need to, and as she stepped away from the table once more, returning to the rhythm of the room, Edward Langston remained seated in front of a meal he could afford 1,000 times over. Yet for the first time, it was not the food that held his attention, but the realization that control, once assumed, could be taken without force, without noise, and without asking. The table had settled into a quieter rhythm, not because the conversation had ended, but because it had changed shape, and Edward Langston felt in the spaces between each word, in the way his guest no longer waited for his reactions, in the way the evening continued without needing his approval, and he adjusted his cuff slightly, a small, controlled movement that served no purpose other than to remind himself of where he sat, of who he was, of the structure that had always held. Across from him, the guest finished another spoonful of the bouillabaisse, then set the spoon down with a soft, deliberate sound, his attention drifting once more toward the direction Clara had disappeared, as if the absence itself had weight. "She understands more than the menu," the guest said, not loudly, not as a challenge, but as an observation placed carefully between them. Edward did not respond immediately. He cut another piece of duck, though his appetite had shifted into something less certain, and he spoke after a moment, his tone measured, attempting to re-establish the familiar balance. "Staff are trained well here," he said, the words clean, controlled, but thinner than before, lacking the certainty that usually followed him. The guest did not disagree. He simply tilted his head slightly, considering, then replied, "Training does not create that kind of listening." The sentence did not linger. Long, but it stayed long enough. Edward set his fork down again, this time not because he was finished, but because he had lost interest in the act itself, and his gaze moved toward the room, scanning without focus, searching for a point of control that no longer responded the way it had when he arrived. The restaurant had not changed. The lighting remained soft, the conversations quiet, the service precise. Yet something fundamental had shifted, and it had happened without announcement, without disruption, without any of the signals he was accustomed to recognizing. Clara returned moments later, not rushed, not delayed, simply on time, carrying a small tray with 2 glasses of water refreshed without being asked, and she placed them down with the same exact alignment, the same quiet precision, her presence re-entering the space without claiming it. Edward looked at her again, directly, no longer through her, no longer past her, and there was something different in the way he held that gaze, something less certain, more deliberate. "You corrected me," he said, his voice even, but stripped of its earlier edge, the statement not an accusation, but a recognition. Clara did not react immediately. She allowed the words to exist for a brief moment, not avoiding them, not answering too quickly, and when she spoke, her tone remained calm, unchanged, only slightly, "Sir." The response was exact. It neither denied nor emphasized. It simply placed the truth where it belonged. Edward nodded once, a small motion, almost imperceptible, and for the first time that evening, he did not follow with another statement, did not reclaim the space with explanation or authority. The guest watched the exchange quietly, his expression composed, but there was a faint shift in his posture, a subtle acknowledgment of what had just occurred, not as a confrontation, but as a correction of balance. Clara stepped back again, her role unchanged, her presence steady, and yet everything around her had moved, not because she had forced it, not because she had demanded it, but because she had not needed to. Edward reached for his glass, finally taking a sip, the motion slower than before, more considered, and as he set it down, the sound was softer, less declarative, blending into the quiet rhythm of the room rather than cutting through it. He glanced once more toward Clara as she moved away, her figure, merging seamlessly with the rest of the staff, indistinguishable at a distance, and yet impossible to overlook now. And he understood something then, not fully, not comfortably, but enough to recognize that the shift he felt was not temporary, not a moment that would pass with the course, but something that had already settled in a place, quietly, completely, and without asking for permission. The room continued as it always had, steady and composed, but Edward Langston no longer experienced it the same way, and that difference, subtle at first, had begun to settle into something he could not ignore, because every detail he had once controlled now existed without waiting for him. And for a man who built his world on precision, that absence of control was louder than any confrontation could have been. He leaned back slightly, his hand resting against the edge of the table, his fingers tapping once, then stopping, as if even that small gesture no longer belonged to him with the same certainty. And across from him, his guest had shifted into a quieter posture, no longer observing Clara, but reflecting on what had already passed, as if the most important part of the evening had already occurred. Edward glanced toward the service area again, his eyes searching for Clara, not out of irritation, not even out of curiosity anymore, but something closer to recognition. And when he found her, moving through another section of the room, her focus unchanged, her movements identical to before, he noticed what he had missed earlier, that nothing about her had actually changed, not her pace, not her tone, not her posture, which meant the shift had never come from her at all. It had come from him. He looked back at the table, at the plate that was no longer the center of his attention, at the glass that now sat untouched, and he exhaled slowly, not in frustration, but in understanding, the kind that does not arrive all at once, but settles piece by piece until it cannot be denied. She did not need to correct me, he said quietly, not looking up this time, his voice lower, less performative, more honest than anything he had said since he sat down. His guest did not respond immediately. He allowed the statement to remain in the air, then answered with the same measured calm he had carried throughout. The evening, no, she did not. There was no judgment in the reply, no agreement, no contradiction, just a placement of truth that required nothing further. Edward nodded slightly, his gaze fixed on the table, and for a moment he seemed to withdraw from the performance entirely, no longer the man who commanded rooms, but simply someone sitting in one, and that distinction, though small, changed everything. Clara returned again, this time not with food, not with explanation, but with something simpler, the quiet act of clearing a finished dish, her movements as precise as before, her presence neither heavier nor lighter than it had been at the start. And as she reached for the plate, Edward looked up at her once more, but the expression in his eyes had shifted, the sharpness replaced with something quieter, something that did not need to assert itself to be understood. Clara, he said, using her name for the first time, and even that small detail carried weight, not because of how it sounded, but because of how it did not. She paused, just enough to acknowledge him, her attention steady, her posture unchanged. Yes, sir, she replied. He held her gaze for a brief moment, then spoke, not loudly, not for the room, but simply for her. The duck was excellent. The words were simple. They always had been. But this time, they were not a verdict. They were an acknowledgment. Clara inclined her head slightly, accepting the statement without reaction, without expansion, and as she lifted the plate and stepped away, she left behind the same quiet space she had created from the beginning, one where nothing needed to be forced, nothing needed to be proven, and nothing needed to be said twice. And Edward Langston remained seated in that space, no longer trying to reclaim it, no longer trying to define it, but finally understanding that some shifts do not announce themselves, they simply happen, and once they do, the room never belongs to the same person again. The evening did not end with a dramatic shift or a final declaration, and that was what made it linger, because nothing in the room announced that anything had changed, and yet everything had, in ways that could not be reversed or explained away, and Edward Langston sat with that realization not as a sudden revelation, but as a quiet weight that settled deeper the longer he remained still. The plates were nearly cleared now, the table returning to its original simplicity, white linen exposed again, glasses half full, the remnants of a meal that no longer held significance. And across from him, his guest had leaned back, his posture relaxed, his expression thoughtful, as if the evening had offered something more valuable than the conversation they had come to have. "You built your reputation on control," the guest said after a moment, his voice calm, not confrontational, but precise, placing the observation gently between them. Edward did not look up immediately. His fingers traced the edge of the table once, a small, absent motion, then stopped. "I built it on certainty," he replied, the distinction subtle, but intentional. The guest nodded slightly, acknowledging the difference without challenging it, and let the silence return because there was nothing left to prove, nothing left to argue, only something left to understand. Across the room, Clara continued her work, unchanged, moving from table to table with the same measured pace, the same quiet attention, her presence neither elevated nor diminished by what had occurred, and that consistency was what made her impossible to ignore now, because it revealed that the shift had never been hers to begin with. Edward followed her movement briefly, then looked away, not because he was finished observing, but because he no longer needed to, and that, more than anything, marked the difference. The check arrived without announcement, placed gently at the edge of the table. The leather folder aligned perfectly with the grain of the wood beneath it, and Clara did not linger after setting it down, did not wait for acknowledgment, did not insert herself into the moment. She simply placed it and stepped away, leaving the decision where it belonged. Edward opened it slowly, not with the casual indifference he had shown earlier, but with a deliberate awareness of the act itself. And he looked at the total, though it did not matter, not to him, not in the way it once would have, because the number was no longer the measure of the evening. He reached into his jacket, retrieving his card, placing it inside the folder with a controlled motion, then paused, his pen hovering just above the paper, and for a brief moment he considered something he had never considered before, not the amount, not the gesture, but the meaning behind it. And when he wrote, his hand moved slower than usual, the ink settling into the paper with a weight that matched the moment. He closed the folder and set it down, not pushing it forward, not signaling, simply leaving it there. His guest watched him, not with curiosity, but with understanding, and said nothing because nothing needed to be said. Clara returned to collect it, her movements unchanged, her expression composed, and as she lifted the folder, her eyes met Edward's for a brief second, just enough to acknowledge the exchange, not the amount, not the gesture, but the moment itself. And then she turned, walking away with the same quiet presence she had carried from the beginning. Edward remained seated, his hands resting on the table, his posture no longer rigid, no longer defined by control, but by something quieter, something more deliberate. And as he stood to leave, the room did not shift for him the way it had when he arrived. No heads turned, no atmosphere adjusted, and for the first time in a very long time, he did not expect it to, because he understood now that presence is not taken by volume or position, but by something far less visible, something that does not announce itself, something that simply changes the room and leaves without needing to be seen. Outside, the night had settled into that quiet stretch where the city no longer tried to impress anyone, where the lights reflected softly against the pavement and the movement slowed just enough to feel intentional, and Edward Langston stepped out of the restaurant without the usual sense of transition, because for the first time, leaving did not feel like an exit from stage, but simply a continuation of something that had already shifted before he stood. The door closed behind him with a muted sound, sealing the warm, controlled atmosphere inside. And for a brief moment, he remained still on the sidewalk, his hands resting loosely at his sides, his gaze unfocused, as if recalibrating to a world that had not changed, yet felt different in a way he could not ignore. His driver had already pulled the car to the curb, the engine idling quietly, a reflection of routine that had always followed him without question, and yet Edward did not move toward it immediately. Instead, he glanced back once, not at the building itself, not at the sign or the lights, but through the glass, just enough to catch a glimpse of the interior, of the same tables, the same soft glow, the same quiet rhythm continuing without interruption. And somewhere within that frame, Clara moved, indistinguishable from a distance, just another figure in black and white, just another part of the system he had once believed he understood completely. But he knew better now, not because she had told him anything, not because she had proven anything, but because she had not needed to. The driver stepped out, opening the door with a practiced motion, waiting, as he always did, and Edward acknowledged him with a small nod, still not moving, his attention lingering just a moment longer than usual before finally shifting away. When he entered the car, the interior felt the same as it always had, quiet, controlled, insulated from the outside world, and yet the silence carried something new, not empty, not expectant, but reflective, and he sat back, his posture relaxed in a way that did not rely on presence, did not demand attention, simply existing without performance. The car pulled away smoothly, merging into the flow of the street, and Edward watched the city pass by through the window, the lights stretching into lines, the movement steady, predictable. And for the first time in a long time, he was not thinking about the next meeting, the next decision, the next assertion of control. He was thinking about a single moment, a single correction, delivered without emphasis, without intention to dominate, and yet it had done exactly that. Not by force, not by volume, but by precision, by timing, by restraint. He leaned his head slightly against the seat, his gaze softening, and the realization settled more clearly now, no longer abstract, no longer distant, but simple and exact, that authority built on assumption is fragile, that control without awareness is temporary, and that presence, true presence, does not come from being heard the most, but from knowing when not to speak at all. Back inside the restaurant, Clara continued her shift as if nothing had happened, her movements unchanged, her focus steady, clearing tables, refilling glasses, adjusting details that most would never notice. And if anyone had asked her about the evening, she would not have marked it as different, not because it lacked significance, but because she did not measure moments the way others did. She did not hold on to them, did not revisit them. She simply moved through them with the same quiet consistency that had shaped everything she did. And in that quiet consistency, something remained, something that did not follow Edward out into the night, something that stayed behind, woven into the rhythm of the room, invisible, steady, and undeniable, because the loudest shift in the room had never been the words spoken, but the silence that followed them, and some silences, once heard, never leave. Morning arrived without ceremony, the kind of quiet light that slipped through glass and settled across polished surfaces without asking for attention. And inside the restaurant, the room carried the same composed elegance it always had, tables reset, silverware aligned, nothing out of place, nothing left behind from the night before, at least not in any way that could be seen. Clara Whitmore stepped through the door at the start of her shift with the same measured pace, her posture unchanged, her expression calm, as if the hours between had erased everything but routine, and she moved into her role without hesitation, tying her apron, adjusting a glass by a fraction of an inch, aligning the edge of a menu, so it sat perfectly parallel to the table. The world did not pause for moments that were not announced, and she did not expect it to. By noon, the room had filled again, different faces, different conversations, the same quiet rhythm repeating itself with subtle variations, and Clara moved through it all with the same steady presence, invisible to most, essential to the flow, her attention shifting from table to table with quiet precision. At exactly 12:30, the door opened, and the slight change in air was enough to draw a few glances, not because it demanded attention, but because it carried something familiar, something that had been felt before, and Edward Langston stepped inside, not with the same force of presence he had carried the night before, but with something quieter, more deliberate, as if he understood now that the room did not need to adjust for him to exist within it. He paused just inside the entrance, not scanning for recognition, not expecting the shift he had once taken for granted. And when the host approached, he spoke simply, requesting a table, no emphasis, no expectation beyond the request itself. Clara noticed him not because he stood out, but because she noticed everything, the slight difference in posture, the absence of urgency, the way he waited instead of assuming, and when she was assigned his table, she approached with the same calm composure she had carried the evening before, no acknowledgment of familiarity, no shift in tone, just the quiet professionalism that defined her presence. "Good afternoon, Mr. Langston," she said, her voice even, placing the menu in front of him with the same precise alignment. And he looked up at her, not with surprise, not with dominance, but with recognition, and something else, something steadier, something that did not need to prove itself. "Good afternoon, Clara," he replied, her name spoken without hesitation, without performance, simply as it was. And for a brief moment, the space between them held no tension, no imbalance, just clarity. He opened the menu, his eyes moving across the French text without resistance this time. Not because it had become easier, but because he no longer needed to perform understanding where it did not exist. And after a moment, he looked up, meeting her gaze directly. "I will have what you recommend," he said, the words simple, but carrying a weight they had not held before, not a surrender, not a gesture, but a choice. Clara inclined her head slightly, acknowledging the request, and for the first time, there was the faintest shift in her expression, not a smile, not approval, but something almost imperceptible, a recognition of alignment rather than authority. She stepped away, her movements unchanged, the room continuing around them as it always did, and Edward Langston sat at the table not as the man who controlled the space, but as someone who had learned how to exist within it, and that distinction, quiet and complete, needed no announcement, because the room had already adjusted, not to him, but to the absence of everything he no longer needed to be. And somewhere within that quiet balance, the truth settled, not spoken, not emphasized, but clear enough to remain, that dignity does not rise to meet noise. It simply stands where it is and waits until the noise fades.